Is the microphone working?
Yes.
Does that work? Okay, good. I'm going to put it in my pocket then. Thank you all very much for coming out. I noticed it rained. Thank you for coming out in the rain. I'll tell you a little bit about myself and what I do for Catholic Answers, just in case. I know that not everybody knows what it is. Catholic Answers is, it's called an apologetics apostolate. So apostolate just means a lay ministry in the church, basically. And apologetics went through what's called, is it too quiet? Should I talk louder? Okay. Okay, it's good? All right. I do apologize for my voice, by the way. When I'm on the radio, I have an absolutely beautiful voice. You should hear it. It's like silk. It's like velvet. It's did you all remember Johnny Mathis? It's kind of like that. Okay. Yes. No, it's not actually. I don't. But it's not usually this bad. Okay. But I lost it here somewhere in New Zealand. I know where I lost it. I lost it in Auckland. If you see it, send it to me. But so Catholic Answers is part of what's kind of been called the new apologetics. So apologetics has always been part of the church. In the very first centuries of the church, there was an effort to explain Christianity to Roman officials so that they would know that Christianity wasn't a threat. And so Justin Martyr, for example, wrote famous letters to the emperor explaining the Christian faith and defending the Christian faith as peaceful and as good for the empire. You can tell by his last name that didn't really work out for Justin, because martyr is actually not his last name. He was martyred eventually for his defense of the Christian faith. So we've always done apologetics. That's always been a part of the life of the church. But in the 20th century, it fell out of favor sometime in the middle of the century because we had the ecumenical movement begin. And so some people thought that the ecumenical movement, where we're trying to bring Christians together, was a better way to go than trying to defend specific Catholic doctrines and try to defend Catholicism. Well, the problem was that while ecumenism is extremely important, and there's no Catholic that can reject it because it's the teaching of the church that Christ prayed for all of us to be one, and that we have to work to be one with our brothers and sisters. But what happened was, as the media age got going, we saw consistent attacks on the Catholic Church. We saw consistent attacks on the doctrines of the Catholic Church. And so a movement began of people to defend the church, to explain the church. And it's very fortunate because today, with the online environment, on TikTok, they might get an 11-second video of something that accuses the church of this or that. And now we have a TikTok account. So we respond to those TikTok challenges. And so a kid who's just scrolling through has at least a chance to hear the Catholic side of things. Catholic Answers began by making little pamphlets because the primary thing that Protestant fundamentalist evangelicals in the United States who were anti-Catholic, it's a small group of a larger group, but the anti-Catholic fundamentalists were pamphleting. They were doing a lot of giving out pamphlets about how you were going to hell if you were Catholic and all that kind of thing. So our founder began writing response pamphlets and giving these pamphlets out, so just to help people have a confidence in the Catholic faith and know that it could be explained in a way that would kind of keep people from falling into the kind of unfair depictions that fundamentalists were making. The first really big one of these pamphlets was called Pillar of Fire, Pillar of Truth, and it went all around the world. There are millions of copies of Pillar of Fire, Pillar of Truth around the world. After the pamphlets, they got in the Catholic Answers. And this is what we're talking about 30 years ago, got into the publishing business, started publishing books, publishing a magazine, and then the radio show, which I'm the host of the radio show, started about 25 years, almost exactly 25 years ago. It was 25 years ago last January, the show started. At that time, when Catholic Answers began having a radio show called Catholic Answers Live, there were only 7 Catholic radio stations in the United States. So it was really kind of an act of faith to decide we're going to do a radio show when there was only 7 stations that would play it, and we didn't even know if they would all play it. But it turns out that the very year that Catholic Answers started making a radio show was the beginning of a revolution in Catholic media in the United States. Mother Angelica, who you may know from EWTN. I don't know how much exposure you have to EWTN here, but you know about Mother Angelica from Alabama. She started the Eternal Word television network. It's all over the world now. Well, she had made a promise to these three guys who wanted to start radio stations, Catholic radio stations. If you buy the stations and start programming or put them on the air, I'll give you 24 hours a day free programming. And so excuse me, I have an alarm going off for some reason. I don't know what that is. I apologize. Apparently there's something I'm supposed to be doing right now. I hope that I'm doing it. I don't know, maybe that was for this, but I do that all the time. Do you ever set alarms and you're like, I have no idea what this alarm was for? It's better than my old system, though, of writing notes and then losing the notes. So I have a lot of ways to forget things. But, excuse me?
Angelica.
Oh, yeah, so Mother Angelica was giving the programming away for free. And so more and more people realize I don't have to do very much to start a Catholic radio station. I got to find a station that's for sale. I got to find a way to pay for it, and then I got to find a way to pay for keeping it on the air. So the laity in the United States began to start radio networks and start radio stations. So since in 1997, when our show started, there were 7 Catholic radio stations. There were 1,500 Protestant radio stations in the United States. Today, Protestants who have always been good at radio, they still have their 1,500 radio stations, but there's 500 Catholic radio stations across the United States. And some of them are in Spanish, some of them are in English, but we're on just a little bit fewer than 400 Catholic radio stations. We're also on satellite radio, so people who have satellite radio in their country, that includes the United States, but also parts of Europe and other parts of the world, they can get us via satellite radio. We're also on apps, like people have the little apps for their phone. So now we've grown to a show that was on 7 stations, to a show that people call us from all over the world from 3 to 5 p.m. every weekday in the United States, or in California, 3 to 5 p.m. For here, I believe that you are 4 hours ahead of us, plus 1 day, but let's forget about the day. And so that would mean if it's 4 hours ahead, it would be, 8 to 10 p.m. if you wanted to listen to it live. But we have an app you can get, the Catholic Answers app, and then you can listen to it anytime. So if you want to listen to it while you're commuting or whatnot, here's the deal with our radio program. It's very, very simple. Anybody who has a question about the Catholic faith can call up and ask it. And we'll have a clergyman or a layman or a sister or a lay woman who's educated in the faith, and we'll answer any question that comes to us. And it turns out that as simple as that little formula sounds, it makes for fascinating radio. And we have thousands and thousands of listeners who are not Catholic, many who are non-believers. They don't believe in God. But they listen, maybe because something inside of them wants to listen, but also sometimes because they want to yell at their radio while they're driving, and sometimes because it's just really interesting to hear the conversations that we have. Because Catholic radio is not like any other form of radio. I've gotten to listen to a little bit of Christian radio since I've been here, and I really liked it. I thought they do a very, very good job, but I only, maybe all told, listened to a half hour or an hour of it. But it's very, very good. But it is slightly different than what we do, which is conversation. And conversations about the faith are not happening anywhere in public. They're not. You can't go on the local TV network. You can't go on, the big international TV networks and find ongoing, sincere interactions between people who are pro-choice and pro-life. People who don't believe in God, some of whom hate God, and people who love God and believe in God. But we love to have those conversations. So our motto is charity and clarity. And and I think it makes a very, very good show. I hope you'll get the app or listen to us on YouTube or one of the other ways that, I mean, there's a million ways to listen. One other nice thing about this program is we give it away free, so anybody can play it. So if any of you start a Catholic radio station, you can have it for free. But you got to start the radio station, and or your app or your parishes, put it on their website, whatever. We give it away for free, and we can do that because when we're on the air, we ask for donations 4 times a year. So 4 times a year, we take a few hours to ask for donations, and we raise enough money to pay for the whole thing for the whole year in just a few hours of asking. And I think that's because Catholics actually have a sense that we need this public voice now, that there's a kind of pressure against the church and we need this public voice. So we get we've gotten calls from every continent except Antarctica. No one has ever called us from Antarctica. But we get calls from Australia regularly. We get some calls from New Zealand. But I'm hoping, now that you're all going to download the app and listen, that you'll pick up the phone and call. But we get calls from Europe, which is very interesting because usually if someone in Europe calls us, it's about midnight in Europe, depending on where you are, but usually roughly midnight. So they're up late listening, and they want to call and ask a question. They live in a very kind of de-Christianized society. We get calls from Africa. Africa, of course, directly south of Europe. So that's usually about midnight there as well. So the 2 most common countries we get calls from in Africa are Uganda and Nigeria. We also get some calls from South Africa. But it's wonderful to have these conversations with Catholics from around the world, you know, and I think it kind of gives people a little hope too that there is actual Catholic community. Like this Catholic thing is the same everywhere, and people have the same questions, and it's very exciting to interact like that. We get calls from the Philippines, and when people call from the Philippines, they always say good morning to us, even though we're on in the afternoon, because of course it's morning for them. One time, a very nice man from the Philippines called, and we said good morning to him, and he said good morning to us, and we said, what are you having for breakfast? And he said, I'm having an American breakfast. And so we said, what is that? What are you having for your American breakfast? And he said, noodles and chicken. And we honestly couldn't stop laughing in the studio because I don't think there's ever been a single American that ate noodles and chicken for breakfast. I don't think that's ever happened. But somebody had told him that that's what Americans eat, so I guess that's an American breakfast. But the conversations are friendly and they're fun and they're light, but they're also very profound sometimes, especially on those days when atheists call us or when pro-choice people call us. Those are very intense days. They're sometimes difficult. Sometimes people, like one time, a young woman called who was very, very pro-choice, and Trent Horn was the apologist who was talking with her, and he gave an example in which someone murdered me. And he said, could you murder Cy? And that's it. And he's only just trying to start a conversation so that he can work his way back to the baby in the womb. But the girl didn't say no. She said, well, what country is this in? And I spoke up because I did not want to be murdered. I said, what does that have to do with it, what country it's in? And she said, well, morality depends on the society you live in. So what if it's a society where murdering people is okay? And we were like, there is no society where murdering people is okay. But it gives you a sense of the intense indoctrination in some places where they think that all morality is relative. So you want to say, we don't say, we try very hard not to say. But you want to say, so the Nazis, right? You always want to go to that because nobody wants to say, yeah, because that was their values, that was okay for them to do that. But the reason we don't do the Nazi thing is it tends to end the conversation kind of, even if the person stays on the line, you've kind of crossed a line that hurts, and then so we just try to keep asking questions about, isn't there anything that can never be done? Are there any acts that you can never do? And this young woman would not admit that there were any acts that were forbidden, that were morally wrong everywhere, all the time, in every place. So honestly, where else do you get conversations like that? But one of the things that I began to notice about, please stop, phone. one of the things I began to notice about the calls was that there are a lot of people who know nothing about religion, know nothing about the Christian faith. And by nothing, I mean nothing. And I think I had been in my Catholic bubble a little bit and didn't realize that there are people for whom even the most basic terms are unfamiliar. And I'll just give you one example that I gave to some folks here that I visited with earlier, because this one really hit me. It was a kid. Well, he sounded like a kid. He sounded like a teenager. And it was a sincere call. He was not messing with us. But we said, like Bob from Milwaukee, what's your question? And he said, hey, I've heard of Catholic and I've heard of Jewish. Are those the same thing? And listen, and we had to explain to him what it means to be Jewish, what it means to be Catholic, and all that. And we're happy to give the explanation. It's not that we're bothered to answer a perfectly good question. It's just that question means that kid was raised completely separate from things that everybody knew just 50 years ago. That really this was common knowledge just 50 years ago. And now a whole generation is coming up without even that basic introduction. So what we have done in recent years at Catholic Answers is we've made some books that are very, very basic. I think that they're not dumbed down, but they're answering the basic questions. Because when we started, we were responding to the attacks of fundamentalist Christians. And then in the early 2000s, we had to respond to the new atheism. But today, we're not dealing with people we don't deal with as many people who want to challenge us and fight with us about the faith. What we deal with more is people who don't understand and kind of don't care. That is, they have a kind of, like we'll get a call from a parent who says, my child just says she's not religious, she just is not interested in any of this. This is a growing phenomenon, this sense of being totally detached from the whole religious thing completely. So the first of these kind of introductory level books we did was Why We're Catholic. And we sell it very cheap, because we want people to have it. I think it's selling for like $4 now or something like that, maybe $5, I don't know. In New Zealand, it would probably sell for $300. I'm just judging by the prices I've seen here. I don't know. I would never buy gas here. Let me just tell you that. I don't know what I would do, but I'd get a horse or something. Yeah, but that book sold almost 500,000 copies now. Why We're Catholic. So then we have another book from Jimmy Akin. That book is called The Bible is a Catholic Book. And it's just a basic introduction to how the church put the Bible together and how the church presented the Bible to the world. And then we have a book called The Early Church Was the Catholic Church. This one is mostly for Protestants because they believe that they want to get back to the way the early church was. So we're just trying to show, well, the early church had the Mass, and the early church had priests and deacons and bishops and all that. So the early church was the Catholic Church. And I got to write the Jesus book because we had to do a basic introduction to Jesus. And that's the book that I want to talk to you about tonight, or just some of the ideas in that book. And the book is called A Teacher of Strange Things: Who Jesus Was, What He Did, and Why People Still Follow Him. And it's broken into 3 sections: the who Jesus was, the what He did, and the why people still follow Him. I want to share some of what's in there and why I think it's important that we share these things about Jesus. And also talk about the fact that we do have to reintroduce much of the world to Jesus. They don't know who He is or what He did, and they certainly cannot imagine why anybody still follows Him. As a matter of fact, what they think happened is something like there was probably a wandering preacher, and then his disciples loved him, and then he died. And then they started to, imagine that He was alive again. And so they started preaching that He was alive again. And then they made up this religion where they used some of what He said, but they made up all these other things that went with that. That's actually what they think. And it's historically provable that that's not true. Like, Jesus is not a figure that is outside of history. We have historical information about Him. But if you ask a lot of young people, they'll go, well, there's not really any historical information about Jesus. He's kind of lost to history. There's more historical information about Jesus than any other private figure in the history of the Roman world. The documents that we have, excuse me, I apologize for my voice. The documents that we have about the life of Jesus, the manuscripts go almost all the way back to his life. Like the earliest manuscripts or manuscript fragments go to within, maybe 50, 60 years of Jesus' life. Maybe 70, maybe 80, I don't know. But the really early, pieces of, the earliest stuff we have is some written pages from the Gospel of John. But they're exactly the same wording that we have today in the Gospel of John. And they're certainly late first century, early second century stuff. So now you go, well, why is that? That doesn't seem that close, like the modern kid. Well, okay, so how about we take Caesar's account of his wars, his Caesar's kind of propaganda that he wrote. So these are written by Julius Caesar. The earliest manuscript we have of Julius Caesar, this is the most important guy in the ancient world, second most important guy in the ancient world. And 800 years, that's the earliest manuscript we have. 800 years difference. Cicero, who was this great Roman philosopher who lived just before the time of Jesus. 800 years between his right. So we can tell them, we can explain to young people, look, if you believe that Cicero lived and wrote all this stuff, and you believe that Caesar lived, well, the evidence for Jesus is much stronger than that, much stronger. And then we have lots and lots of evidence that what the Gospels tell is historically accurate. And for all that information, I'll suggest Jimmy Akin's book, The Bible is a Catholic Book. But we have to get through all the wrong stuff that they learned in order to share with them what can actually be historically be known about Jesus and about the people who followed Jesus. So that's what I tried to do in the first section of the book, is just explain that, the ancient world is not, like we have thousands and thousands of manuscripts from the ancient world. These are not things that are just lost to the mist of history. And then when we find new documents from the, like for example, in the 19th century, a Bible scholar who's skeptical might say, there's no evidence for Pontius Pilate. Pontius Pilate doesn't appear in the records. And then in the 20th century, they find these, stone carvings that say Pontius Pilate governor. So you go, well, actually, the Bible seems to have known this before modern scholars knew it. The Pool of Siloam, you should really read about the Pool of Siloam, okay? It's part of one of the greatest stories in the Bible. And nobody could find the Pool of Siloam. So there was this general consensus that John made this story up. Because it appears in John's gospel, the last gospel. They always go the theological gospel, it's not real history. Well, it must be close to 20 years ago now, excavating outside the walls of Jerusalem, they not only dig up the Pool of Siloam, it's the exact same shape that John said that it was in his gospel. So as we get more, and there are many, many, many evidences in the documents that are being discovered, and many, many evidences in the archaeology that's being done, that the Gospels are actually quite accurate. And like, if you could say in the 19th century, well, the Pool of Siloam, they probably just made that up. And then somebody goes out and finds it, you go, well, that proves that the Bible was accurate, right? And then they go, no, because there's three other things that it's, and then, well, they'll find that eventually, and then they'll have another excuse. The evidence from science, the evidence from just digging around Jerusalem has been overwhelming in favor of Jesus. Just a few years ago, the Franciscans said, let's build a retreat center. You probably know about this. They're going to build this big Franciscan retreat center. And then the Israeli antiquities people say, no, you can't build your center there because there's something down there. In Israel, you got to dig first before you can build, because you got to see there's something down there. They dig it up, It's a town. Guess what the town is called? Magdala. So we have Mary Magdalene's town in the last, it's very recent, this century, because the Franciscans wanted to build a retreat center. There it is, the town of Magdala. The synagogue in Capernaum. There it is. It's not the synagogue from the time of Jesus in Capernaum. They dug it up. So the evidence for Jesus is very, very strong, and the documentary evidence, that is, the chain of possessing the Gospels, is stronger than any other book in the ancient world. We have more copies of the Gospels closer to the time of the actual historical events than any other document. And I only mentioned Caesar and Cicero because you would think, well, there must be some ancient documents of them, and that's 800 years versus maybe 80 years for the Gospels. The Gospels are true. The Gospels were written by eyewitnesses. They may have had help of people who, certainly Mark's Gospel was not written by a direct eyewitness, nor was Luke's. I mean, Luke tells you that it's not written by a direct eyewitness. What I mean when I say they're written by eyewitnesses is the material, Luke says he went around and asked. There was a scholar, and I won't remember his name, I apologize. There was a historian that wanted to prove that Luke was wrong. And so he started to study the Gospel of Luke and put it against the evidence, and he said, Luke is the greatest historian I've ever read. It all matches up just perfectly. Now, there is one line of Luke that's very controversial because it seems to put a Roman governor in the wrong place at the wrong time. But they'll figure that out. I mean, I do think there's a very adequate explanation. There's actually, I think, an error in the Greek text. If you say something happened before something or something happened when something, you might write those two words very similarly, and so I don't actually think there's a problem. But okay, so there's one remaining very serious problem with the historicity of Luke. Everything else entirely backed up, and the problem, in a certain sense, is a problem of ignorance. We don't actually know when this governor was appointed. So you got to just stretch and stretch and stretch to find anything in this scripture, in the Gospels particularly, which are history. The Gospels are history. Everything in those Gospels happened. Now, what about Mark's Gospel being out of order? Okay, well, Papias tells us that Mark intentionally wrote his Gospel out of order. He said he listened to Peter's preaching, and he would write down what Peter said, but Peter told little short stories. That's how Peter preached. He tells the story of the walking on the water. So does the walking on the water... I am so sorry that I have this little cough. I will now leave the building. I'm back now.
Have some water.
Oh yeah, that's a good idea. I forgot this was here. Okay, so what I'm getting at, like Mark's Gospel, even the ancient people tell us, Mark took what Peter said, these little stories, and he organized them as he wanted. So Mark never presented his Gospel as being in order, but I do believe John's Gospel is presented to us as in order. That's why it takes 3 years to get, there's 3 Passovers in John's Gospel. So for what they are, for what they're attempting to present, they're 100% accurate. And amazingly accurate. And if you could go back in a time machine to the 19th century, most of the head scholars would have said none of this will ever be proven. And almost all of it has been in the modern era with really good science. So we want to remove that obstacle. And then we want to say, who was Jesus? Well, in my book, I tried to answer the question, who was Jesus first? Because the primary problem of reading the Gospels as a modern person is that the Gospels present Jesus as God. And so you essentially have 2 choices when you read the Gospels. And I mean all the Gospels present Jesus as God, including Mark's Gospel, especially at the end of Mark's Gospel, where Jesus is put to death for blaspheming when he says, I am, are you the Son of the Blessed? I am, and you'll see the Son of Man come in on a cloud. Okay, this is Jesus using I am, the phrase that means that in Hebrew is essentially the name of God. And then we know that he was claiming to be God because the gospel tells us that the high priest ripped his garment and said, blasphemy. Well, the only way it could be blasphemy if Jesus is making a divine claim. So in all four, whatever anybody says, all four gospels tell us that Jesus is God. So here's the problem. As a modern reader, you gotta accept that he's God, or you got to revise the Gospels. In your mind, you got to revise the Gospels. You got to say, well, they said that, but what really happened was. And that's what modern people do. They go, well, yeah, but what really happened was. Or sometimes they say, well, the Gospels are spiritually true, but they're not historically accurate, you know? Or they do a thing like Deepak Chopra does, you know, the great kind of entrepreneur of selling spirituality. And he says, well, what Jesus did was he achieved enlightenment. That's what they mean. He achieved enlightenment. He's a man like the Buddha who achieved enlightenment. The problem with this is none of it actually fits with what the gospel writers wrote. So I tried to say right in the beginning of my book, I didn't want somebody to get this book who doesn't know Jesus and try to like finesse it a little bit and go, well, you know, I'll work my way towards him being God, because that's not the way the gospel is presented. The gospel is presented as this is God. And so you have an identity problem, and it's an identity problem that kills Jesus. The identity problem is he claims an identity that the chief priests and the Pharisees cannot accept. That's why they kill him. That may not be why they say they kill him, but that's why they kill him. He made himself equal with God. All right? So we have to present to people the truth about what we believe about him. And so right from the beginning, we have to say, Jesus was a man who lived in Nazareth at this time, while Augustus is the Roman emperor, and then at his death, who the Roman emperors and governors. We tell them all the historical facts of it. But we say he came claiming to be the Jewish Messiah and being the Lord. As the very beginning of Mark's gospel says, Luke's gospel, Messiah and Lord. What they meant by Messiah was the one who Jews were expecting. What they meant by Lord was Lord. They meant God. Lord is because Jews don't say the name of God. It's a very common word. So when they said Messiah and Lord, when the angels tell the shepherds Messiah and Lord, that means this man is both the Messiah of the Jews and the God of the whole world. That's what we believe, and we got to help people to get there, because we can't do the thing where we present Jesus as a nice guy or a good guy or a good spiritual teacher because none of that does them any good. Because you get to the death of Jesus and then it makes no sense. What good is that? What's the point of that? It's just some poetic lesson that he's going to teach us in love, that he's kind of a nonviolent and he stays groovy all the way to the cross? No, that's not what he's doing. He's offering his life as both as a divine person who has taken on our humanity. He's offering it to God to save us. Well, none of that makes sense if he's not God. None of that makes sense if he doesn't have something to offer, a pure and perfect sacrifice. So that's what I try to do in the first part of the book. And I would encourage you to, first of all, be confident in yourself that this really is God. He's not like anyone else. He is not like anyone else. And one of the proofs I try to give of that in the book, and when I say proof, I don't mean a metaphysical proof, just very strong evidence that people will take as a proof, is the overwhelming success of Christianity at transforming the world from darkness to light. And so we have to tell the history of Christianity so that people will know that before the Christians came, if the Romans didn't like a baby, they would just take it out and throw it in the trash. That was Roman practice. Before the Christians came, gladiatorial combat was common. Before Christians came, women and children were literally the property of men, which was no longer possible after Christianity, because Christ taught the equality of all before God. You cannot own someone who is your equal. Just to give a very precise and specific example of what that means. Before Christianity, the consent of the bride was not needed for marriage. The consent of the father was needed for marriage. Once Christianity becomes established, the consent of the bride is required for marriage. As a matter of fact, if you don't give your consent, or you give your consent under duress, that marriage is not valid. That's what the church taught. And the church taught this unbelievable ethic of love, which, how many of you, when you turn on the TV and there's a Christian, a really Christian character on the show, how many of you go, oh, this person's going to turn out to be a weirdo? Like on TV, Christians are portrayed as, well, that person's probably the murderer, or is probably some kind of secret weirdo in some way. That's how Christianity is portrayed. And you know why I believe that that's portrayed? I believe that's an act of propaganda that they don't make intentionally. But if a Christian is not weird, if a Christian is not the murderer, then a Christian is a person who actually believes that God is love and that they have an obligation to love one another. So you either portray that as weird, or you have to join. Like, you can't say no to people who believe that God is love and that you have to love one another, and it's a life of forgiveness and mercy and generosity. So instead of rejecting what a Christian really is, they portray a weirdo, probably creepy, murderous Christian. And I could tell you show after show on Netflix in which anybody who starts the series or the movie as a really loving Christian is going to be found out to be the creep before the end of the movie. Christianity was extremely successful in transforming the world. Christianity created the first multicultural, multilingual society in the history of the earth. That had never existed before. This multicultural, multilingual society that the Catholic Church created had no king, had no earthly ruler, but it was one society. During the High Middle Ages, you could go from Moscow to Portugal, you could go from Iceland to Jerusalem, and it was all one society, speaking hundreds of different languages, having scores of different political systems, having a whole variety of cultures. But when the Pope sends St. Anselm from Italy to be the Archbishop of Canterbury in England, nobody complains because it's the same community. This is our brother. They built the first multilingual, multicultural society in which there was no overriding authority oppressing everyone. People willingly participated in that society. They built science, they built hospitals. We got to tell that story because that's evidence for Jesus. If we want people to accept Jesus, we got to let them know the consequences of accepting Jesus overwhelmingly are good. Wherever a society fully accepts Jesus, it's more peaceful, it's more educated, it has better health care, all of that. That's true for 2,000 years. The second part of the book is, what did he teach? And here, that's where we get the title, A Teacher of Strange Things. It's important that people know that Jesus taught primarily 12 apostles. And then maybe, 58 other people or 60 other people, because there's this 72, and then there's 120 mentioned. So there's a wider community, but at the core of it is 12 apostles. So Jesus formed a church by teaching the leaders of the church that he intended to leave behind. We can't ignore this story. We can't just gloss over it. And at the heart of that church was sacraments. The strange things in my book, A Teacher of Strange Things, is that I'm trying to get at is the sacraments are strange. They're weird. They're not like anything else in the world. They are gifts, truly divine gifts they have nothing to compare them to. So I'll just give you a quick example of what I try to do in the book. When in John's gospel, there's a man blind from birth. And the apostles say to Jesus, who sinned, his mother or his father or him? And I think I might be misquoting that part. I've forgotten it at the moment. But Jesus basically goes, nobody sinned. That's not what a disability is. Nobody sinned. So he clears that up. There's no moral fault in a person who has a physical disability. And then he spits on the ground. And he picks up the mud. And he puts it in the blind man's eyes. And he says, go wash in the pool of Siloam. And you'll be able to see. Well, I've always wondered, how did that guy find the pool of Siloam? But maybe, okay, he may have known the way. The guy goes and washes and he can see. And then there's a long kind of trial of Jesus where the Pharisees are trying to prove that he's evil, and he did this with the power of Satan. But one of the things in that is when he comes back, his neighbors go, that's the same man. And then some of them go, no, that's not the same man. He just looks like the man who was blind. John didn't put these details in there by accident. What Jesus is teaching, because Jesus is not a magician, he's not a wizard, he's not Gandalf. He doesn't need to spit on the ground and make mud and put it on his eyes. He spits on the ground and makes mud because that's what human beings are made of. God made human beings out of mud. Why does John tell us the man was blind from birth? Because the man doesn't need to be healed. Blind from birth, in the Jewish understanding, is the man needs to be remade. You'd have to start over from the beginning if you were going to get a man born blind to be able to see. So just like God used the stuff of the ground, the dirt, to make Adam, Jesus uses the stuff of the ground to remake the man born blind, which is why when the man born blind comes back, his neighbors say, is that the same man? Or is that a different man? And where does this happen? People always say Jesus healed him with the mud on his eyes. No, he did not. He put mud on his eyes. He told him, go wash in the pool of Siloam. Then you will be healed. And the guy washed in the pool of Siloam. What is Jesus teaching us? He's teaching us the regenerative power. The regenerative power of baptism. Baptism makes a new man. You're not the same man. You were blind, now you can see. You were dead, now you're alive. He teaches us in many, many ways the sacraments. And the sacraments are not an add-on or an extra. They are the very heart of the Christian faith. So when someone says, why does it matter what church I worship in? Read them the 9th chapter of John's Gospel. Say, why did Jesus put mud on that guy's eyes? There's no reason for that. Jesus doesn't need to put mud on his eyes. So you have to tell me, why did he do it? Because as a Catholic, I can tell you why he did it. He did it to tell me that he's God and he can remake me in the sacrament of baptism. And then in the last part of the book, I get into why do people still follow Jesus? And it comes down to 4 reasons why people still follow Jesus. First, they meet Jesus. You got to meet Jesus. And if you're listening to me right now and you have not met Jesus, or you do not know if you have met Jesus, what you need to do is just say it to him. He's right there. Lord, I'm not sure that I've met you. Or I know I have not met you and I want to meet you. What do you think is the percentage of people who the Lord comes to after they pray that? If they pray it sincerely. What do you think the percentage is? 100%. Thank you, a Catholic man. Jesus said, ask and you will receive, seek and you will find. He didn't go, ask and there's a good 30% chance 90% of you will find. It never fails. Now, how will Jesus enter? Will you recognize him? I don't know. But you ask for it, he will come. And then after meeting Jesus, there's the walking with Jesus, like Peter did for 3 years. You got to walk with him to become like him. Now, you all are Kiwis. That's what you call yourselves, right? From New Zealand, Kiwis. And I'm from California. And if I came here and lived with you, after a while, I would begin to talk like you. What I'm saying is I would begin to talk like weirdos. Because everybody knows that you say weird things. Like, in America, we have a shopping cart. It's a shopping cart. It's a cart that you put your shopping. You have a trolley. What is a trolley? A trolley is a thing that goes down some tracks in the middle of the street, but you say trolley. But here's what would happen. If I lived with you, I would say trolley. I would begin to become like you. But Peter knows that Jesus is the Messiah. He practices becoming like Jesus. He willingly takes on the mannerisms. He responds to slights the way Jesus responds to slights. He prays the way Jesus prays. That's what we have to do. That's called conversion. After meeting Jesus, we have to undergo conversion. And then Jesus pours out communion with us. That's the third thing. Jesus pours out communion. This is the third reason people still follow him, because they enter into communion with him. He does it in many ways, but primarily he does it at the altar for us. And any of you who have spent time in adoration know he really does want communion. He wants friendships with us. And then the fourth reason that people today still follow Jesus is because once they have met him and become like him and entered into a life of communion with him, they go out on mission and invite other people to get to know Jesus, which is a perfect place to stop, and we'll have some dinner and you can ask whatever questions you want. Jesus is God. The world has forgotten God, and the world has certainly forgotten that Jesus is God. The only way to repair the damage that's been done is one by one, painstakingly, our children, our relatives, our friends, introduce them to the loving person of Jesus Christ so that they can start on the journey of conversion, communion, and maybe even join him in the beautiful work of mission. Mission is what we are. We are a society in a communion of love on a mission to bring everyone else into that community of love. I'll leave it there, and I hope that I will get to join you for dinner. How about as we end, let's just give glory to God. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen. Father, Son, Holy Spirit, amen. Thank you all. Thanks very, very much. I'm sorry about my voice.